All right, so for our second hour, we have Dr. Daniel Faber of Northeastern University here, and we are so excited. So welcome to Dr. Faber. As our first speaker for our GradCAMP speaker series. Dr. Faber is a professor of sociology at Northeastern University and a senior research fellow at the Global Center for Climate Justice. He is also the director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaborative. His research is focused in the areas of political economy, crisis theory, environmental sociology, climate justice, social movements, environmental justice, and more. So thank you so much, Dr. Faber, for joining us this evening, and the floor is yours. I will stop sharing my PowerPoint.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm very happy to be here. And so I think we might need to share my screen. And so do I have those privileges now? Let's see.
You should.
Yes, you
Let
should.
us know if it doesn't work.
Okay. All right. So tell me if you can see my screen. Okay, can you see that, Jennifer?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. So let's get this up. There we go. So I'm very happy to be here and the kickoff speaker. I hope that we have some time for questions at the end. I have a lot to go over. Today was a big day, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But I would like to talk about tonight climate justice, environmental justice, and the climate crisis. And Jennifer and anyone else, if there are questions as I'm speaking, and there, it's better for that question to be asked then rather than at the end. I'm okay with that. So I'll allow you to monitor the questions, okay? Because I won't be able to really see it.
Got it.
So today I want to talk about climate justice and want to put forth the proposition that one of our most fundamental rights as a human being, a human right, as a right of citizenship, and even the most fundamental civil right is to live in a healthy and clean environment. It's a right that's guaranteed by the Massachusetts Constitution, by the constitutions of other nations as well, including Brazil. So when we're talking about climate justice, one way to think about it is the fair treatment of people and the creation of policies and projects that address climate change. And climate injustices are the ways in which people, through unjust systems of power, experience a disproportionate impacts around climate change. And so the climate justice movement emerges out of the environmental justice movement. I've been working with leadership of the environmental justice movement for some 30 years. I'm on the board of Coming Clean, which is an organization representing over 130 different organizations, such as Greenpeace and Environmental Justice Health Alliance. And we help make strategies for the movement behind the scenes and try to address the root causes of ecological crises, particularly around energy and chemicals policy. And more of our work is fusing struggles around environmental justice and climate justice together in more holistic approaches. And we can talk about that down the road as well as the work we're doing at the Global Center for Climate Justice. But one of the propositions that I would make is that very often it's in the interest of capital, major corporations, and the state to cut costs and save money by displacing, or what is often called by economists, externalizing harm in the form of pollution and toxic waste onto the larger public and the environment, rather than installing pollution control equipment or paying for the costly but proper disposal of toxic waste and so forth. And what we find is very often that this logic of externalizing costs into the larger society is driven not only by the necessity of economic efficiency, but also by issues of political expediency. What paths offer the least resistance? Because after all, if you're knowingly inflicting harm upon a community, that is a profoundly antisocial act. And so very often the form that this takes is designed in order to minimize political opposition and offer the path of least resistance. So a good example of this would be in the state of California a few years ago, where the state wanted to respond to the growing garbage crisis and issues of medical waste and toxic waste through a process of incineration. And very, very quickly, major problem with the incinerators is that in the process of burning toxics, they produce super toxics out of the smokestacks, dioxins, heavy metals, mercury, and so forth. So it's really dangerous to live near an incinerator. And the residents of California knew this, and they weren't willing to accept such facilities. So the state of California hired Sorrell Associates to do a study for them, their consulting firm, to make recommendations. And on page 51 of the report, they conclude, under no such circumstances should such a facility be built within a 1 mile radius of a white middle-class community because of the greater likelihood of encountering political opposition. Nowhere do they report, do they refer to where are the optimum geologic, geographic, or climatic conditions that would minimize public harm. It was solely in terms of ability of a community to offer political opposition. In fact, they recommended that the state target lower income communities, Catholic communities that were considered to be more conservative, rural communities, and communities where the offending facility is on one line of the political jurisdiction and the affected population is on the other. They also footnote communities of color. After the report is released, incinerators were built all over the state of California, including 17 in the Los Angeles area. Every single one of them was built in a low-income community of color. In the high impact area, less than 2 miles from the incinerator, 91% of the residents were people of color. So the point here is that very often it's not just corporations or capital, but often the state will engage in actions that target those communities that have less political economic power to resist the imposition of dangerous and environmentally harmful facilities. And in the United States, we're talking about African-American communities, Latino communities, indigenous communities, and very often Asian American communities as well. And it's not just peculiar to the Western United States or the Sun Belt, but even in so-called blue states like Massachusetts. Similarly, the state of Massachusetts decided to build 4 incinerators within a 12 square mile area of downtown Lawrence. Lawrence at the time was the poorest community in the state. It had the lowest household per capita income. It was 80% people of color, primarily a new immigrant population where the majority of the people did not speak English as their first language. In fact, they came from many different parts of the world. The community was deeply fragmented by race and ethnicity, but also national background and origin, different languages, customs, and so forth, which did not allow the community to come together and speak with one voice. So they became an easy target. I was talking with a DEP official at the meeting when this decision was made, and the discussion was, well, we knew it was politically unacceptable to have such a facility built within the Boston area. So we decided to target this new immigrant community. The Biodiversity Institute did a recent study, and they found the highest levels of mercury in the entire eastern United States is found in the Merrimack Valley around this community, because each one of those incinerators released over 2,000 pounds of mercury directly into the environment each and every year. So sometimes communities of color where they're homogeneous, where there's strong organization and they can speak with one voice, sometimes they are more difficult to target by corporations or the state. And so often in Massachusetts and throughout New England, we often find it's the new immigrant communities where many of them may even fear for deportation. They lack right to citizenship, that even within communities of color, often there is unequal targeting for the most hazardous facilities based upon the power of a community to offer resistance. Very quickly, I just want to give you some of this data. I did a major race and class or environmental justice study in Massachusetts. eventually helped write the environmental justice policy for Massachusetts, and then helped write the executive order on environmental justice issued by Governor Patrick before he left office. And I was very interested in looking at the distribution of toxic waste sites here, and I just thought I'd bring this to your attention. What you see is in predominantly white communities, there's an average of 2 hazardous waste sites per square mile. At the time we did the study, there were 31,000 in the state. But what you find in communities of color, there's an average of 48 hazardous waste sites per square mile, over 24 times greater. And you don't often see this in the social sciences, but it's a 1-to-1 correlation, meaning that as a community becomes more racially diverse, there is a direct and corresponding increase in the frequency of hazardous waste sites in those communities. In fact, race is the most powerful predictor of how many waste sites exist in any community in Massachusetts. And as you see, class is also a significant factor. Let me move this out of the way if I can. Class is also a significant factor. Can't get back to it for some reason, but not nearly as significant as race. Very quickly, we're also interested in where is chemical pollution being released from the largest industrial operations in Massachusetts. The 12-year period I was looking at, there's the equivalent of 80,000 tractor trailer trucks. If you go to a gas station, you see the big tanker trucks unloading gas in a gas station. So imagine 80,000 of those filled with toxic pollutants. That's how much pollution was released into the Massachusetts environment by these large facilities over a 10-year period. And what we found is that, again, predominantly white communities, there was an average of 19,000 pounds of chemical pollutants released per square mile in predominantly white communities, which is nothing to sneeze or cough about. That's very, very significant, and it's often reflected in cancer rates found in Massachusetts and much of the Northeast. Breast cancer, for example, Cape Cod has the highest breast cancer rates in the country, second only to Long Island. But it pales in comparison to predominantly communities of color, where it's almost 200,000 pounds per square mile of chemical toxic pollutants released into those communities. We also broke it down into different families of chemicals, such as chemicals that cause cancer, birth defects, genetic disorders, and so forth. And what we found is the worst of the worst chemicals are far more disproportionately released into communities of color as well. So, for example, 4% of all the carcinogens released by polluting industry were released in communities of color, even though communities of color make up only 10% of the communities in the state. So when you begin to ask the question, why is there a disproportionately high rates of asthma and respiratory diseases and cancers and birth defects and so on in communities of color, the answer can be found in these highly disproportionate exposures to environmental pollution. From a climate justice perspective, this is really important because there's a term called co-pollutants. So if you're looking to reduce CO2 emissions, very often wherever you have CO2 emissions, you also have the release of other types of pollutants, which are really harmful to human health, such as PM matter, particulate matter 2.5. And so therefore, programs that are targeting CO2 emissions often end up also addressing these co-pollutants, and they disproportionately benefit communities of color. So this is just another dimension of the climate justice issue. What is going on? I can't get it to move. Okay. Anyway, so let me try this here. So here we see class biases. Low-income communities also disproportionately exposed to higher levels. and it drops off dramatically as you move into higher income communities. If you look at power plants, some of the most polluting power plants in the country, 68% of African Americans in the United States live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant. And these conditions are replicated for the most part in the Northeastern United States. In fact, believe it or not, even though this is a blue state region, the greatest racial disparities found anywhere in the country with respect to sulfur dioxide emissions aren't found in the Southern United States. They aren't found in the Western United States. They're found in the Northeastern United States, Boston, Providence, New York, Hartford. So again, even though we think of the Northeast as being much more environmentally progressive, and I just showed you some of the data and the distribution of hazardous waste sites, these racial disparities are as great as you will find anywhere in the United States. All right. So we developed a measure for looking at the cumulative environmental burdens of communities of color, all types of pollutants, tire piles, hazardous waste sites, toxic waste sites, polluting power plants, 17 different types of hazards. And we gave points to those facilities based upon how hazardous they are to communities. And basically what you see is the total environmental burden in communities of color is over 22 times greater than it is in predominantly white communities. And so, in fact, if you live, and in the interest of time, I didn't show you this, but I ranked the 30 most polluted communities in Massachusetts. 24 of them were communities of color. In other words, 80% of the communities which make the worst 30 in Massachusetts are communities of color. And again, they only make up 10% of all the communities in the state, which means if you live in a community of color, you are 39 times more likely than if you live in a predominantly white community to live in one of the most dangerous and most polluted communities in Massachusetts. And again, class is also a really important factor. If you run a regression analysis, for those of you who know how to do statistics, you combine class and race and you find the most powerful determinant of whether or not you live in a community with an illegal toxic waste dump, with an incinerator, with a polluting industrial facility, is whether or not you live in a low-income community of color. Nothing else comes close. And even if you control for urban and suburban bias, the race disparities reproduce themselves. So if we're to speak about climate change and the climate crisis and climate justice, very quickly, I just want to go over what you often see in the media in terms of the discussions of climate change are three dominant perspectives. The first is that anthropogenic climate change, which is man-made climate change, is not real or serious, and that action, political action or policy is not needed, it's not warranted. I'll come back to that perspective in a second. You also sometimes see a perspective, well, climate change is real, but it's a very gradual, linear process, so we can engage in measured incremental action to begin to slow it down. It will crest at a certain point and begin to reverse itself. For many years, this was a dominant perspective held by most of the world's governments in the climate negotiations that were taking place. Where most of the world community is right now is that climate change is happening now. The climate crisis is upon us, and it constitutes a planetary emergency that requires dramatic and immediate action, that basically we have to move towards a fossil-free economy with no CO2 emissions by the year 2050. And by the year 2030, we need to cut these emissions in half, or else we are going to pass certain tipping points at which climate change will be unstoppable. So I just want to say a few things about this from a justice perspective, from a sociological perspective, which I think you might find very interesting. There's so much to talk about, and I'm cutting out so much great material. But the dominant perspective that around climate denialism, that climate change isn't real or it doesn't pose a significant threat. In fact, it might even result in a tremendous greening of planet Earth, for the most part, is being fomented by what I call the Polluter-Industrial Complex, which is a very sophisticated infrastructure of think tanks, policy institutes, research centers, public relations firms, foundations, so forth, that are funded by the most egregious corporate polluters in the United States, headed up by the fossil fuel industry. The oil and gas industry currently sits on over $100 trillion in known fossil fuel assets, and they treat the climate change movement as a threat to their ability to exploit those assets. And so they have been funding climate denialism, the most sophisticated, well-funded corporate propaganda campaign in the history of humanity, to the tune of $900 million a year through these various think tanks like the Heartland Institute, the Heritage Foundation, all designed to convince the American public that climate change is not real. Last year, the global oil industry made $200 billion in profits, and they pretty much showed an unwillingness to sacrifice those profits in the name of the planet. And we'll get in and talk about this, but one of the things that's very interesting to me, and I just did a major report on this that was published at the Global Center for Climate Justice. We're giving a presentation in DC next week between a number of congressional representatives that's being organized by West Harlem Environmental Action, as a premier environmental justice organization in New York City. And what I did in this study, it's on voter suppression and the attack on voting rights in the United States. And the dominant media discourse is, oh, this is being led by the MAGA wing of the Republican Party and so forth. And what we did is we traced the money. And what we found is that the money overwhelmingly is coming from the corporations, the major corporate polluters that are funding climate denialism. And they're targeting predominantly communities of color for rollbacks of voting rights, and actually youth, college students, because they have some of the strongest voting records around climate change and environmental justice. And so they are funding the organizations that are creating the blueprints for how you begin to roll back voting rights. They're funding the lawmakers who are sponsoring these bills. Over 417 bills have been introduced over the last 2.5 years in states all across the United States, designed to curtail and roll back voting rights, predominantly in communities of color and among college youth. Texas, you can't vote on college campuses now. They eliminated 80% of the polling places in Fulton County, African-American community. And then when the lines got really long, they passed a law making it illegal for anyone to give out food or water to anyone standing in line to vote for 5 or 6 hours. So this is a pretty significant attack that's now taking place on America's democratic institutions, the replacement of nonpartisan election officials with partisan election officials. And the point I want to make here is that it's predominantly being funded by the fossil fuel industry and its corporate allies. If we want to talk more about that, we can, but you can read the report. So again, 140 foundations that are funded by the big oil, 91 climate denial organizations. These figures are a little bit old, but $900 million a year to convince the American public that climate change is not real. The second scenario that was dominant under the Obama administration, that climate change is incremental and we can engage in these less urgent responses, less dramatic responses, and try to create a balance between economic growth and saving the planet. And while that may have been true 30 years ago, most of the scientific community argues that that now is a prescription for a long-term disaster and is no longer adequate. And so now we arrive at scenario number 3, which is that climate change is a planetary emergency. Today was a very important day because it was the first day of the meeting of the Climate Ambition Summit that was called by UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who argues that we are on the path to a climate catastrophe and urgent action is needed now. And he's demanding that nations come to this summit with mandatory reductions in CO2 emissions, with plans for those mandatory reductions. Otherwise, he says, we are going to soon pass these tipping points and we won't be able to stop it. Currently, right now, as I mentioned, the oil and gas industry, $100 trillion worth of assets. If they burn all those assets, those known fossil fuel reserves, it's going to take us 5 times beyond what the scientific community says is safe. And we will have so much CO2 in the atmosphere that the last time we had this, which was, they estimate that somewhere around 900 parts per million of CO2, if you burn all the known reserves, that we're going to live in a world that's 11 degrees warmer by the end of the century. So the business model of the oil and gas industry is now fundamentally incompatible with the future of humanity as we know it on this planet. And so the climate community is now arguing that we are now reached a point of a planetary emergency. The United Nations agrees. We are now 419 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere compared to 280 parts per million at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Last time we were this high was 3 million years ago, where the Earth was 5 degrees warmer than what it is now. And because of the greater warmth, the melting of the ice caps and the Arctic sea ice, oceans were 50 to 80 feet higher than they are today. So under this scenario, if we continue with business as usual and don't begin reducing the content of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's just a matter of time before the ice sheets of Greenland and West Antarctica will be gone. It may take 100 years, it may take 200 years, but if those ice sheets go completely, then you're looking at a rise in ocean levels of well over 100 feet, at least 20 feet, depending on how extensive the melting within 100 years, which means cities like Boston and New Orleans are no longer, they're gone. So one of the principles of environmental justice, and by the way, I don't have time to get into this, but I think this is a really important point to make. And Jennifer, if you're interested, I can send you the link, but I was a consultant on a PBS series that really explains this science to a lay audience, why the models have changed so dramatically in the last few years. And I've been reading and teaching around this for 30 years, and I've just watched this, is that 20 years ago, the ways in which climate change unleashes certain biofeedback mechanisms was really poorly understood. But now we know that there are feedback mechanisms that are now being unleashed by climate change, which serve to magnify the impacts of global warming. In other words, climate change is beginning to feed upon itself. So as the permafrost in the northern hemispheres begin to melt, processes of biological decay begin. The microbes begin eating that decaying matter, and they release CO2 and methane into the atmosphere and results in dramatic warming. It's been estimated that if 80% of the permafrost melts in the northern hemisphere, which is the path we're on now, that they are capable of releasing as much CO2 in the atmosphere as has the US economy, the total releases of the US economy of CO2 emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Meaning we can go from 419 parts per million to 700 parts per million like that. And that's what's so interesting about paleoclimatic evidence. This notion that climate change is very incremental has now been disproven by going back into the climate records of the planet. We know that climate change can occur in very abrupt and very dramatic measures. So that's the worry, that if we pass these certain tipping points, the process by which climate change is beginning to feed upon itself will be unstoppable. And this is this notion of tipping point. So as 40% reduction in Arctic sea ice over the Arctic, that's a giant mirror. It's like an air conditioner for the planet. It reflects all that sunlight back into space. But as it melts and begins to shrink, where the Arctic region has increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1950, you get more open ocean, and all that heat and all that energy that used to be reflected back into space now becomes absorbed by the dark waters of the ocean, and you get a much more dramatic warming. So that's another feedback mechanism. What we're really seeing now is with the increased droughts and so forth, world's forests are drying out. There's a new book out saying we've just entered the era of the Pyrocene, because these droughts are making the forest very, very fragile, and we get an explosion of some of the most dramatic forest fires the world has ever seen, whether they be in Australia or in Canada, which we saw this summer. In fact, Europe saw the most profound wildfire ever in its entire history just this summer in Greece. And that in turn releases more and more CO2 in the atmosphere and reduces the capacity of the world's forests to absorb CO2. So this is why the scientific community is so alarmed right now and so concerned, because this is happening much faster than they originally predicted. And it just brings up a greater sense of urgency that we have to ramp up our efforts to reduce emissions, or else we will pass these tipping points. So one of the fundamental tenets around environmental justice and climate justice is that, again, industry or capital, various corporations, and the state, in following the path of least resistance, will target communities that have less political economic power, what we in sociology call control capacity over their own communities, for a whole host of different polluting industries. And so we talked about the Sorrell Associates. I don't want to have it in there. And I'm just, in the interest of time, going to pass this, but I do think it's worth noting that 2023 is now going to go down as the hottest year on record since human civilization began on this planet. July and August were the hottest months ever recorded in human history. A couple of years ago, Massachusetts broke temperature records in February with 70-degree weather and tornadoes. We just had tornadoes in Massachusetts in this last storm. February 2 years ago, the temperature reached 99 degrees in Oklahoma. That's in February. 116 degrees in Sydney. While that was occurring, the temperatures in the Arctic Circle went above freezing for the first time ever recorded, 54 degrees above normal. So as a result, the Earth's temperature now exceeds the mean average temperature of the Holocene in the 20th century, meaning if you were born in the 21st century, you have never experienced a year with the average temperature of that of the 20th century. We have now entered a new climactic period, the Anthropocene. And just a couple of things. If you were on a trajectory to somewhere time between 2070 and the end of this century to surpass 900 parts per million CO2. Last time we had that much CO2 in the atmosphere is 53 million years ago. Inside the Arctic Circle and Antarctica, the average temperature was 77 degrees in the summer, and frost-free winters. The average temperature around 50 degrees. Crocodiles and palm trees grew in the Arctic, while the heat indexes were 170, 180s, meaning that life, human beings, would not have been able to survive in the equatorial regions of the globe. So the average global temperatures were 14 degrees warmer than what they were today. The oceans were 10 degrees warmer. And so at current rates of fossil fuel energy consumption, which is currently, this is what's being planned by the fossil fuel industry, that $100 trillion of known fossil fuel assets. This is where we'll be if they are successful in developing all $100 trillion. We're going to be at where we haven't been for 53 million years. And so if you look at the models that are being put forth by the leading climatology centers all over the world, my favorite is the Hadley. I think they do some of the best work. This is their predictions for 2070 to the end of the century. This is not Fahrenheit, this is Celsius. So this is 9, 10, 11 degree predictions for the planet if we continue on this business as usual. That is why the United Nations on this day held this emergency summit and considers it to be a planetary emergency. We can now add 2022 and 2023 to this list. And there are different scenarios of where the temperatures will level off. If we do what's right, then we're going to be at the bottom blue. We can level temperature increases off at 2 degrees Celsius, and then through a process of restoring habitats and ecosystems began to reverse climate change. It is reversible. And I will say this, Michael Pollan is a director at the Political Economy Research Institute at UMass Amherst. And he's done some numbers on this, and it's really interesting. I'm actually fairly optimistic. It's very, very doable economically. To get to zero emissions by the year 2050 requires spending $4.7 trillion a year on the transition. This past year, $1.3 trillion was spent on renewables. Current subsidies to the fossil fuel industry globally, according to Poland and the IMF, are somewhere between $6 and $7 trillion a year, both direct and indirect. So we just eliminate the subsidies that go to the oil industry for something we don't want, fossil fuels, and redirect them for something we do want, renewable energy. There is more than enough money to pay for this transition. And all we need to do is see a reduction of around 4 to 5% in emissions each and every year, and we will achieve our goals by 2050. So it is very doable. I know it sounds overwhelming and so forth, but it's very much within the realm of possibility technologically and economically. It's really a question of political will and the power, again, of the polluter-industrial complex and the grip they have over our democracy. And the way they're responding to this challenge, again, is by trying to curtail our democratic institutions. This is what is so dramatic to me about this moment in history. All this billions and hundreds of billions of dollars coming down from the Biden administration through EPA, Justice 40, and so forth. This is this moment where we can make a dramatic leap into a transition to a cleaner, greener, and also a more just economy. So I've talked about the feedback loops. I won't talk about that so much. Climate change, this has been a record book. If you look at the Red Cross, they put out a disaster report each and every year. The frequency of natural disasters related to climate events is just escalating dramatically. It kills about 300,000 people a year worldwide, and those numbers are growing. And I will say more about that in just a moment. So when we talk about climate injustice, I want you to think about 3 dominant forms that injustice takes. There are many more subcategories, but in the interest of time, we'll focus on these 3. The first are related to domestic socioeconomic injustices. And that is the manner by which the impacts of climate change are disproportionately displaced by capital and the state onto poorer populations, those populations that have less political economic power. They have a greater degree of vulnerability to the impacts of climate change because they lack the resources, the political economic power, the political clout to protect their communities. So we'll talk about New Orleans, but for example, when Hurricane Katrina was barreling down on New Orleans, well, 3 months before that event occurred, I had my class read a report that was in National Geographic that predicted exactly what would happen in New Orleans, which was a massive flooding of the lower Ninth Ward, communities of color, white working class communities, because the levees were not adequately fortified to withstand a major event like a hurricane. Everyone knew it. New Orleans was on the federal government's number 3 list behind New York and San Francisco of the most likely place to experience a major natural disaster. And they attributed that to the lack of investment in the fortification of the levees designed to protect the African American and poor white communities around New Orleans. So everyone knew it was a disaster waiting to happen. And instead, the money was spent on fortifying the wealthier areas of the city. So this would be an example of environmental racism. It would be an example of class-based discrimination exercised against poor populations that they are simply not worth protecting. 175,000 African Americans were displaced by Hurricane Katrina because of the massive flooding that occurred when those floodwaters broke through the levees of Lake Pontchartrain and destroyed their communities. Only 75,000 of them came back. So when we speak about climate refugees, we have them right here in the United States, and they are overwhelmingly people of color. Another dimension of this is international injustices, and that is the way in which the impacts of climate change are often being disproportionately felt by some of the poorest countries in the global south, and yet the vast majority of the benefits of the CO2 emissions have been reaped by the richer countries in the global north. So I did a lot of work for a number of years with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention on the health impacts of climate change in the Pacific Islands. And we were looking at the way the sea level rise and the king tides were beginning to intrude in the saltwater lens of low-lying atolls and destroying their water supplies and greater frequency of diseases and droughts and so forth. And because of sea level rise, a country like Kiribati is going to be literally wiped off the map in the next 10 to 20 years. And the president has begun a process of relocating the island's population to Fiji and Indonesia, and they're exploring how can they preserve their culture, even if their traditional land is washed away. Kiribati is responsible for 0.000000001% of all global CO2 emissions. I made that number up, but you get the point. And yet they are going to be wiped off the face of the earth. When Obama was president, he pledged $100 billion in a fund to pay the climate debt that is owed by the United States to these poor nations that are going to be wiped out. They're on the front lines of the climate crisis. Ended up only giving $30 billion. But more and more we see calls from nations of the global south for nations of the first world, nations of the global north, to help pay this climate debt, to help pay for this transition and adaptation, but also more importantly, to reduce their emissions and begin this transition to a clean, green economy. And then there's a notion of intergenerational injustices. And that is the way in which the decisions that are being made today or not being made today are going to impact younger generations, your generation in particular, your children and your children's children, and people who haven't even been born yet. And so this is really fundamental. And so we see the growing involvement of youth because this is the first generation in American history that is really facing an existential crisis with regard to their future in this nation and on this planet. Sociologically and from a policy perspective, I just want to point out something here. This requires a whole new politics. It requires a whole new approach to address climate justice issues that's so different from many other issues because it requires broad-based transformations of our economy and of our society. And you're, again, taking on some of the most powerful corporations in the world. And so it requires a mass mobilization. It requires people coming together and crossing those difficult racial, ethnic, cultural, class-based divides that separate us from one another inside the United States and by geographic region. It requires that we begin crossing those international divides and taking into account the interest of people in the global south, as well as our own interest. And it requires us to make decisions where we take into account the needs and aspirations of future generations that have yet to be born. And so we've never had to do this before, let alone in one area, but all three simultaneously. So this is a tremendous challenge that is really unique to doing climate justice politics. It requires the invention of a whole new way of doing politics and having discourse with one another and building these types of coalitions. And that's what we're kind of committed to trying to achieve at the Global Center for Climate Justice. A key concept here, which you can't see because I have it blocked here, is this notion of vulnerability. So if you're thinking about, I don't want you clicking these buttons accidentally, what it says, climate change vulnerability. And again, how the degree of vulnerability you have to climate change is a function of political economic power, whether you have any or whether you don't. And so climate change impacts fall hardest on those households or communities or even societies, as we've talked about, that are the most ecologically vulnerable, but also lack the political economic capacity to cope and adapt to climate change. In fact, what climate change does is it magnifies pre-existing social and environmental injustices. In many ways, it's what's called a threat multiplier, because it exacerbates other types of social and environmental injustices, whether they be economic or racial injustices or health-based, so forth. So an example of this would be one things that we're seeing. Miami is a classic case of where this is going on. Ironically, historically speaking, the coastline is where some of the wealthier residents and communities are located in Miami. They want to be near the water. It's an aesthetic wish. It's an asset. But with sea level rise, which is really profound, parts of Miami are being flooded even on sunny days at high tide. The city's trying to refortify itself to withstand this sea level rise, but residents see the writing on the wall and they're moving further back from the water, and they're moving deeper into parts of Miami that are more immune or more protected from sea level rise. And those are areas that are predominantly occupied by lower income people of color. So it results in a process of gentrification and displacement of people of color. And where are they relocating? They're being forced to relocate where property values are lowest. And those tend to be where the dangers associated to climate change are the greatest, in flood zones and elsewhere. And so we talk about the way in which climate change is feeding upon itself. There's a tendency for climate related injustices to also become magnified or multiplied, if you will, by existing unjust political economic structures. And so if you hear me use that term threat multiplier, that's what that means. And sorry, I don't know what I did there. I put together this PowerPoint right before the presentation. So if that's the only bug, then I did well. So what's kind of interesting about this is no matter how you look at it, the numbers of people of color being impacted by environmental injustices and by climate-related disasters are going up. In fact, over the last 5 years, it's the very first time that in national public opinion polls of brown communities, Latinos, for the first time, the #1 issue in Latino communities is environmental pollution. #2, for the first time, it's not #1, is immigration. #3 is climate change. You go back 15 years ago, climate change wouldn't even made the top 10. And so that is because, particularly one of the hallmarks of traditional environmental policy, one of the flaws is that in the Northeast, or like in New York, you can't dump toxic sewage sludge in the Atlantic Ocean anymore. It's a good thing for the ocean. But what did New York City do? Well, it would load 2,000 railroad cars each and every week and transport tons and tons of contaminated toxic sewage sludge across the country to states like Texas, and deposit them in communities like Sierra Blanca, which is 80% Hispanic. 50% of the population lives below the poverty line, and their community becomes inundated with toxic sewage sludge. When Bush was governor of Texas, he created 200 such sites alone when he was governor. Or if you can't dump toxic waste into the Charles River or the Hudson River, like GE dumped PCBs, millions of pounds over a 10-year period in the Hudson River. It's the largest Superfund site in the country. Well, you can't do it anymore. That's good, particularly for the people along the river and won't like to fish and so forth. But if all that toxic waste is not being reduced in volume, but now it's being collected in barrels and contract out to chemical waste management, and then they're disposing of it in toxic waste sites like Emile, Alabama, which is predominantly an African American community in the South, or they're burning it in incinerators in California or other low-income communities of color, then all you've merely done is transport the hazard from one part of the country to another, changed its form from one type to another, and impacted a different type of person that used to be immune in the past. And that's why as more and more ecological crises become displaced to communities of color over the last 30 years, we've seen a corresponding increase in the growth of the environmental justice movement because it's grounded in this reality. And now it's becoming grounded in the reality of climate change. These are the frontline communities experiencing the greatest impacts. But what's really interesting about this past 2 years, if you go back, 1 out of every 10 Americans typically lived in a community that was impacted by a natural, a weather or climate-related disaster. Last summer, it was 1 in 3. This summer, it was 1 in 2. So what that means is the impacts of climate change are becoming much more profound through the general population as a whole. The wildfires in the Western United States or the flooding in Vermont. So this brings up new opportunities for alliances between those communities, indigenous communities, communities of color on the front lines of both the extraction of fossil fuels and the harm done by it, the impacts of climate change, but also the middle class or rural white communities that are now increasingly experiencing these types of climate-related disasters as well. And for
We
that
just have a
reason,
couple more minutes, just a 2-minute warning, Dr.
really?
Faber.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Jennifer, do you have this PowerPoint? Do they all have it available?
Yes, you can send it to me and I can send it out for sure.
Okay.
And if folks want to follow up with questions, if you want to share your email or if you're willing to do that.
Because there's some pretty good data in there. That's Hurricane Sandy. Can I just show you a couple things real quick?
Absolutely.
So if we were to think about the vulnerabilities, I'll just pick out one because that's all I have time for. And sorry, I usually speak much faster, but there's so much to say here. One of the impacts around climate change from a justice perspective is increased heat waves. So for example, the 2003 heat wave in Europe killed 71,000 people. And you ask, who were the people who died? Who were most vulnerable? Again, that concept. And it turns out that it was the poor because they couldn't pay for air conditioning, but it was disproportionately the elderly because they are much more susceptible to heat-related stresses than younger people. And so for that reason, age is also a really important climate justice dimension. And often climate justice policies don't take that out. The elderly often live in isolation. They don't have support networks. And so they get in trouble and there's no one there to help them. No one knows about it. So overwhelmingly, the people died. The heat wave that hit New York a couple decades ago, 800 people died in that heat wave. Disproportionately were the elderly who were isolated and sometimes poor, could not afford air conditioning. I just want to show you what's predicted. This is an older study. It's a little conservative, but it predicts by late century, let's say 2070, that New England will average 14 to 28 days above 100 degrees. And that upstate New York will be more like present day South Carolina. Well, New Hampshire will feel like North Carolina. And as we keep going, Boston will eventually feel like Northern Florida, which by the time you guys retire, maybe not be such a bad thing because instead of moving to Florida, Florida's climate will have moved up here. But you're looking at winters, again, 8 to 12 degrees Fahrenheit warmer if we continue business as usual. This is the official projections of the city of Boston, that if we have business as usual, then we will have up to 33 days each summer where the temperature will be above 100 degrees, and 25 to 90 days compared to 5 days where it's above 100 now, but 25 to 90 days where it's above 90 degrees compared to 11 on average now. So I just want this last point, Jennifer, if I have time for this. This is one case where I'm trying to illustrate environmental justice related to heat. So what you'll often see in low-income communities of color is there are what are called heat islands. And they're significantly warmer due to a lack of parks, open green space, and tree cover. And so studies have been done. They found that low-income neighborhoods in the United States have much less tree cover than wealthier communities. And in New England, there's up to 30% less tree cover. In some cities like Providence and Worcester, it makes these neighborhoods on some levels 7 degrees hotter. If you go out in the suburbs, these heat islands can be 20 degrees warmer than heavily forested areas outside the cities. And part of the reason for that, again, is when cities have planted trees, they require residents to take care of them, to water them. The cities don't water them, and residents don't have the means to water the trees, and they're not maintained. And they plant the wrong types of trees. And so one of the big efforts of the climate justice movement in cities like Boston and so forth is we need to start planting trees. The city needs to help take care of them. We need to plant trees that will provide the cover we need. We need to start painting the roofs of buildings white so they reflect the heat rather than absorb it. And we need to sort of begin climate proofing these communities. So I have lots of examples around this about how climate justice is beginning to be implemented in communities all over Northeastern United States, and how the funds coming down from Justice 40 and IRA and so forth are really enabling cities and communities for the first time to access the necessary funds where they can begin to promote real systematic transformative changes in their communities oriented to climate and environmental justice. The last thing I would say, if I have time, is again, the goal of the climate justice movement and the environmental justice movement is not to ensure that all people are polluted equally. It makes for a terrible bumper sticker. It's not a very good button. I don't think you can rally the movement around it. What is really required is a more transformative politics where we go to the root causes of these social and environmental injustices, environmental racism, begin to form broader coalitions so that we can address these root causes, so that it's not about not in my backyard, but rather it's about not in anyone's backyard. And so that's what we're committed to at the Alliance for a Healthy Tomorrow here in Boston, Coming Clean, and the Global Center for Climate Justice. How can we address the root causes so that it's not about just distributing the hardships equitably, but about eliminating the production of hazards in the first place, that all people benefit. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Faber. That was a fantastic start to our program. We really, really appreciate it, and what a great overview.